As it is with the release of every new Canto, we, usually as a collective, tend to be pretty divided of judging the contents of the newly released story. And of course, it's pretty much to be expected. As Project Moon is a smaller studio, they tend to release about 2 main story chapters yearly. And as a PM Glazer myself, I don't think this needs to be said, but the quality of writing, depth, and care they do tend to put in the story is a standalone in the gacha scheme. So it's also no surprise that we tend to anticipate the release of every new story content, even if it is just a side story intervallo. But this holds specifically true for their main story Cantos. But ever since the release of the newest Canto, which is Canto 9, we have never been even more divided, with some sizable chunk of the fanbase straight up expressing disappointment with the way they handled the story of Ryoshu, with some of the complaints being that they didn't make Ryoshu the actual focus of the Canto, that it's not faithful to the actual work of Ryunosuke Akugatsu's Hellscreen, and that the Canto overall is carried by hype moments and aura. So, in this video, I thought why not try to give my own review of the Canto, maybe attempt to address some of these claims, and change your mind a little. And if I can't do that, then maybe convince you to at least find a middle ground instead. So here it is, my review of Limbus Company's Canto 9, The Unsevering. One of my biggest fears diving into this Canto was the noticeable lack of setup from the previous intervalos, which in retrospect sounds like a pretty reasonable concern, right? Considering we only had a single canon intervalo as a setup between Canto 8 and Canto 9, and said intervalo wasn't even really that much of a setup, but more so a conclusion story for Canto 8 and some minor tidbits for Canto 9. Usually, as we all know, there are supposed to be 2 intervalos preceding the beginning of the next Canto. The first one usually serves as a cleanup for the previous Canto, whilst the second one sets up not only the story for the next Canto, but also the key characters we'll meet as well. Well, since this time around, the supposed second intervalo is completely erased by the fact that we had a collab with Arknights instead, I was genuinely worried since they had basically little to no time on setting up anything regarding Ryoshu's backstory and the characters that would appear in this Canto. I mean, sure, we had some idea of what kind of Canto this was probably going to be, but nothing too substantial other than what we already know of, like all the tidbits from Lei Hang in Canto 8, the info we have about her in general, and some more minor tidbits from the first intervalo. So color me shocked when they practically introduced not 1, not 2, not even 3, but 5, well technically 6, main antagonists. And that's not even counting the finger apprentices, which makes up a total of 11 new antagonists that they introduced in this Canto. And that's still not even counting all the other new and reoccurring characters like the Distortion Detective Squad, the Udjats, and the 2 new potential men, which is actually what the first part of the story, as you can imagine, focuses heavily on. As it is with the other Cantos, part 1 for me is probably the least interesting part, not only cause I've said it's usually reserved as the build-up part, but I won't lie, I was also a tiny bit disappointed that we're already heading back to a familiar place so soon, which is of course the Limbus Company HQ. And this might sound nitpicky-ish, but as it was with the previous Cantos, I was also expecting this Canto sceneries and backgrounds to appear more Japanese. But instead, what we got was basically a murkier/darker reskin of the Limbus Company HQ. That aside, I do really like how they introduced not only the opening scenario of this Canto, which is of course the main Limbus HQ being raided by the House of Spiders, but also how they introduced the 2 key thumb members, Lucio and Valencina. And right from the beginning of this Canto, you could already kinda tell what kind of relationship they have, which of course plays into the relationship between Valencina and Ryoshu as well. Even from the bits from her flashbacks we do get, we could already conclude that Valencina is, to put it lightly, abusive, whilst Lucio has basically completely submitted himself to her will, and more so her teachings, but we'll get back to them later on. Also, I just found it really funny that despite how he looks, you would never guess for him to be stronger than Ricardo. Of course, we're also reintroduced to the 3 characters we've already met in the checkup intervalo, Hohenheim, Alisa, and Martin. But a cherry on top for a lot of people would probably finally meeting the Distortion Detective Squad, but of course in the fashion of a true Project Moon fan, Whilst I do know the general info about the DD squad, I haven't actually read Distortion Detective in its entirety, but I am glad that they finally got their sprites and screen time in this Canto. Oh, and I was also really happy when I saw they brought back Engdu and hinted at a possible bamboo-headed Kim appearance. By the way, one other thing that I also really liked that they incorporated in this Canto was that because of the nature of the direction the story takes us in, they made it so that we had the sinners actually be separated for the first time for a significant amount of time. And this extends to the entirety of Part 2 and basically almost the entirety of Part 3 as well. I think this not only gives slightly more of a risk for the sinners that aren't in the proximity of Dante narratively, but also just makes for a much tougher battle mechanically as well, since you can't just abuse a 12-member status team like usual, and it just generally gives shine to the side characters in general when it comes to actual combat and gameplay, which is a pretty rare event in Project Moon. Nearing the end of Part 1, we finally get introduced to the two main antagonists of this Canto, which is of course Rien and the Dihue Star Shiomiyoru. In general, I would say Part 1 did set up the House of Spiders as a legitimate threat pretty well, if more so the general outline of the respective characters, like with all of the Nurse Fathers and some of the apprentices, which I would also say makes up for the missing second Intervallo as well. Also, let's not forget the hidden gem of Part 1, his song admitting he took a few hits of the joint. Part 2 is, I think, where a lot of people would agree the story really picks up and is a general continuation from the cliffhanger of Part 1, which means yes, our team is still separated, trying to complete the different objectives, and thank goodness the team that Dante is with is the only team we get to actually control, cause I dreaded thinking about having to fight using the base IDs of the other sinners. Anyways, one of my criticisms of this Canto in general that I would consider valid, well, pertaining more to the first and second part, is the noticeable lack of enemy variety they actually have. I mean, considering we are up against the House of Spiders, which was essentially revealed to be a group project that the Five Fingers worked on together, you would expect we would be up against other actual Finger members, like we did in Canto 5, in Canto 6, and Canto 8. But instead, the only new grunt enemy we actually have were these ring pointless auto mannequins, and even a lot of the few bosses early on were just essentially reused abnormalities, but I'll give those ones a pass, cause it did make a lot of sense narratively that we would be fighting a lot of breaching Abnos after the HQ was left in ruins. Also something I noticed, Part 2 is where we really see how phenomenal PM has become in utilizing their side characters, whereas usually the only purpose they would serve is as an indicator for how bleak the situation is or how dangerous the enemy is. Now, PM actively involves them in the progress of the story, and I mean this for generally every single side character, well, except this guy. And it just creates so much more of an atmosphere of terror and dread when we actually give a damn about these side characters. Like when Dante just yoinked the sinners using his new ability, and Hohenheim and Martin was just left alone to repair the facility and possibly fend off against the Ring Maestro. Also, the dialogue that came out between Hohenheim and Martin right before he sacrificed himself was just so beautifully written. The way Hohenheim, through his past experiences, can just know when someone would do something like this for him. Or maybe from the LCD's perspective, when Moses, Ezra, and Engdu were left alone against a great brother from the middle and was just frantically throwing around Apnos like they were Pokemon at Matthias. You could feel the terror they must have genuinely felt, the desperation. Moving back a bit to the perspective of Dante and his group, we meet one of the more interesting characters of this Canto in Sora, the apprentice of the Index. Not only is she able to utilize Shin, but she has also manifested Ego. And I find this very interesting since we all know that to even manifest ego, you would need to be resolute in your beliefs, whilst Carmen tries to break you down psychologically, which means either her faith in the prescripts or her faith in the House of Spiders, aka her faith in Rien, is so absolute that just straight up cancels whatever BS Carmen was feeding to her. And you would never have guessed this by how her character overall is designed/presented, accompanied by her groggy/shy-ish demeanor. So I just really love this new trend of the antagonist being able to manifest ego, because you can tell a lot about the character from their ability to do so. They did it too with Ahab back in Canto 5, which again signifies that manifesting ego isn't about good or evil, strong or weak, but about how resolute you are as a person. Also, speaking about characters, one minor thing I really enjoyed, which I think they did add only recently in Canto 9, is the subtext they have under each passives. It's such a tiny addition, but makes for such a huge difference, since a lot of the subtexts are basically the inner thoughts of the characters, things such as what they're going through as of the moment and what they actually think of some other characters. So yeah, it's overall just a very nice addition. But of course, the biggest revelations and climaxes in part 2 happens nearing the end of its run. One of them of course being the return of Vespa, who in his first in-game appearance just straight up annihilates Sora, proceeds to save his team from the Middle's nurse father, then casually reveals his recent promotion to color fixer. Again, I haven't read Distortion Detective yet, but he's already placed himself amongst my list of favorites. Now, on the more narrative-heavy part of the climax, we pan back to the squad that Dante is with. Of course, after sending our strongest ally away, Dante is basically left pondering on how he and the other sinners are going to deal with the Pinky Nurse father, Shiomiyoru. And you probably can guess where I'm heading with this, Dante's new ability, Malkuth. This ability, though unstable, and probably happened only by accident, gave us some of the most interesting pieces of lore in a while. In face value, this ability seems to function as some sort of telecommunication/telepathic ability that allows Dante to command and communicate with every sinner and summons them to his presence right then and there. Though of course, since the ability itself is not yet perfected, the sinners who are summoned seems to not possess any real consciousness of their own. But this is just an explanation based on the info we were given and the fact that Malkuth in the Kabbalah Tree of Life is not only placed at the very bottom of the tree, but is also supposed to represent the physical world and manifestation of divine energy. Though the most interesting piece of dialogue that occurred would probably be Dante's mentioning of the 13 that stands by his side, to which obviously there are only 12 combat-capable sinners, excluding Dante himself, who obviously is not a combatant. Now a lot of theories have started popping up about who the other possible candidate for the other person excluding the 12 other sinners could be, with some of the more basic ones being Virgilius, but the more interesting one is that Dante here is referring to himself, as in Dante the person, and not the Clawcat as a separate entity. There are some more other interesting ones out there, but I'll leave it here since we don't really have much to work on yet. Of course, the massive final event in part 2 was a showdown between the Pinky Nurse father and the lingering question of Araya's whereabouts. Now Araya is also a very divisive subject on her own, since throughout the entirety of the first and second part, we're not really given much of a clue about her current whereabouts. Whether she's alive or if she even was an actual real person was basically left to your interpretation thus far, and obviously we can't discuss anything more regarding her fully without delving into the final part of Canto 9. If I were to describe Canto 9 Part 3 in just 2 words, it would be peak fiction. Of course, like usual, Part 3 is normally expected to be the most jam-packed part. Granted, some Canto does it better than others. For example, I think Canto 6 and Canto 7 had a really strong Part 3, whilst on the other side of the coin, in my opinion, Canto 8 peaked in Part 2, then barely sticks its landing in Part 3. Now, whilst there are many reasons I could praise Canto 9 Part 3 for, one of the most noticeable things right away is just how much they've improved on camera work, visuals, story cutscenes, and just combat animations in general. This isn't even taking into account all of the amount of effort they've put into making all of the combat sprites for each major key characters. Like, I didn't expect Moses and Ezra to actually appear in combat. Least of all, we also of course can't forget about the amount of banger soundtracks they've made specifically for this part. Now I could go on and on about the tremendous achievements and progress Project Moon has accomplished thus far, but let's finally delve into the story of Canto 9 Part 3. Of course, it continues off the massive cliffhanger ending of Part 2, where literally almost all of the heavy hitters that Limbus Company can muster up gathered up in one place under the same objective, to destroy the House of Spiders. Now again, much like Part 2 and some of Part 1, most of Part 3 also has the sinners divided up into 5 main groups, each one for each specific finger. Which again, I've already stated my reasoning about why I like this decision so much, but I think you see it even more so in this part. You know, considering they make you actually fight alongside the other characters that you don't actually have to control. And the first major encounter we have is with Callisto, the nurse father of the ring and a former maestro, as well as Alpina, his apprentice. And the team they've sent to deal with them consists of Sinclair, Ishmael, Faust, Hohenheim, and Alyssa, which, I'm not gonna lie, sending in 3 nerds, a fisherwoman, and Sinclair to deal with a maestro seems a bit questionable, but thankfully all of the teams are supplied with tons of K-Corp ampules. Now we all know the ring and their obsession with anything pertains to art. even if said art entails the perversion of the human anatomy. Now Callisto is without a doubt the nurse father with the least amount of screen time and development in general, but I think he does his job well in representing what a master of the ring should feel like, if that makes sense. And we can also clearly tell that he was the influence on Ryoshu's twisted form of art as well. And I mean, he genuinely also serves as a pretty good antagonist for Hohenheim's and Elisa's character progression, to a certain extent, which I can't take that away from him. But of course, we all know that's not why I put in this small highlight section for him in particular, as now it's time to address the elephant in the room, a certain Sinclair. The appearance of this new Sinclair via the manifestation of his Mark of Cain has been somewhat teased since his spring cultivation intervallo, and it gave us some of the most insane lore drop this series as a whole has ever seen. One being that we finally got a small glimpse of what Sinclair's mark actually does, and that not every mark has a similar power, confirming that yes, each has its own unique powers. But the most noticeable and practically most insane revelation is the existence of a second Smoke War, as well as a small glimpse of what the war will be about and the new technologies that will emerge from the resulting conflict, which of course probably strongly ties into the date of June 985 in the opening trailer for Limbus Company, where we see the population count of the city drops by the hundreds of thousands. But the most ominous warning he gave was regarding the fate of some other sinners, though not confirming directly who, and the particular one he gave to Foss. And we all know that Foss's Canto is going to be the last by order, which basically indirectly confirms that perhaps something horrific is going to happen to some of the other sinners, whether they leave by choice, fulfilling their contract with Limbus Company and thus completing their contract with Dante himself, or maybe even a worse fate awaits them.
What do you mean by that?
Anyways, moving on, I didn't manage to discuss this yet thus far, so I guess I'll say it right here. Now, this opinion might sound controversial, but one thing that I really like that they showed to us in part 3 is the ceiling of power of the city. Like throughout the Canto, but more so in this part, we take a more supporting role compared to previous Cantos, where usually the solution we have was to just throw the 12 sinners at the problem until we solve it eventually. Or at times we were also just lucky that if we happened to run into a strong adversary, they would be extremely fatigued/injured or just straight up holding back. But this time around, since we're literally up against some of the highest ranking members of each fingers, who, make no mistake, are literally out for our blood, they show us that we would easily have been dead without help from some remarkable individuals, and I think they showcase this the best in the Matthias and Valencina boss fights. Now, I don't really have much to say about Matthias, because again, I think just like Callisto, he takes a less important role compared to the next 3 nurse fathers we'll be talking about, and I don't think his role as a nurse father had any long-lasting impact on Ryoshu's character herself, but he does have a really cool design, and I wish I could say he also encompassed what it meant to be the middle's great father, but that didn't go so well. And now we get to my favorite, or at least a close second favorite antagonist of this Canto. Now, there are a lot of words I can use to describe Valencina, and about 90% of them would be bad words, as you can probably imagine. But the remaining 10% would only be praises I have for the way Project Moon depicted her character and wrote her in a very realistic way. What do I mean by this? Well, if we take a look at Valencina, there's only arguably 2 things that she genuinely cares about: respect and hierarchy. Of course, this probably being a result of the Thumb's way of life, to which Valencina, being a former Sotocapo, a veteran of the war, and an inheritor of the Parliamentan style of swordplay, probably took huge pride in. Of course, via her passives, we also learned that she lost all of that in the mere span of 3 days, which of course, after everything I've told you, one could imagine that dealt a huge damage to her pride/psyche. Valencina, more than everyone else in the House of Spiders, takes up the unfortunate mantle of being the most abusive towards her children. As for her, the past, where she was still officially in the family, is seen as her glory days. Where she is today is but a shadow of that former self, and she knows that, acknowledges that, and would do literally anything to get back to that past self. Of course, one of the most memorable things about her is how she labels her apprentices/children as objects. For her, Ryoshu is nothing more than a ticket, nothing more than a crucial tool for her re-entry to the Thumb. Her love for her children can be described as nothing more than a conditional one. She's not afraid to get physically and psychologically abusive if it meant she could somehow manipulate her children to serve their purpose as, once again, her objects. She is a vile character, a powerful adversary, but in the end, still someone with flaws, and that is precisely the reason I really like her as an antagonist. Also, not to mention, her battle mechanically is just one of the best in the Canto, but alas, she and her apprentice both met their unfortunate end at, in my opinion, the biggest surprise in this canto.
운집은 범람하라. 체력은 창궐하라.
The Roach Emperor is, of course, another very important thing to discuss, because I think it is very interesting that they decided to make our beloved potential man realize his potential exactly here. Gregor's potential has always been somewhat joked about and teased ever since basically the first canto, technically even before we even got to know him, as we knew he was a war veteran, but above all a very important asset to G-Corp during the Smoke War. But it was only somewhat recently has this narrative been explored further in the Checkup Intervallo, coincidentally enough. Again, we always knew that Gregor has always been this important weapon for G-Corp, but I don't think anyone in the fandom could have predicted that he was meant to actually be the trump card of the wing. Literally one of the keywords in his passive states him as a wing's decisive weapon, which implies that his presence alone is supposed to be a checkmate in what is supposedly the next war of the wings, our real-life equivalent to a nuke. Of course, the power he has is no joke either, as it took one of the strongest fixers of all time with full-on ego manifestation, along with Heathcliff and Roja acting as a crucial support to redirect the attack of some of Greg's skills to finally pin him down, which is honestly just diabolical. And the craziest thing about all of this is the fact that we got confirmation from Herman herself later on that this is supposedly just the first layer of many in Greg's true arsenal. And I don't think this needs to be said, but it's pretty obvious that Greg's journey was far from over ever since we finished Canto 1, and that Project Moon has further plans for Gregor and the N-Corp gang in general, to which they'll probably play a crucial role in the upcoming Second Smoke War. And finally, after trudging through everything this canto has thrown to us so far, we finally arrive at the main/final acts of the canto. Of course, understandably, a lot of people by this point would be skeptical if Project Moon could top the previous peaks, that is a certain Sinclair and Roach Emperor Gregor, since obviously this is Ryoshu's canto. Now, the question on everyone's mind is, in my opinion, did I think they managed to conclude Ryoshu's story in a satisfying way? Well, at least for this canto. Well, to answer that, we'll have to look at the two final key players in Ryoshu's story, and as well as the biggest impact on her story overall, Rien, the Index Nurse Father, and Araya, now the Dihui Star, also the Pinky Nurse Father. Going over Araya first, since her story is probably the more confusing one to a lot of people, and not gonna lie, I can kinda see why. So in the context of a story, Araya is revealed to not actually be Ryoshu's biological daughter, as she is revealed to be another project commissioned by the Thumb, to be a replica of Yoshihide, another killing machine. Now of course, this isn't to say that Ryoshu didn't actually care for Araya as her actual daughter, because she did. For her, Araya is probably the first moments of her feeling actual love in a non-conditional way. Of course, a major theme for this canto in particular is the relationship between parent and child, and furthermore, one that revolves around the red thread of fate, which not only they keep showing to us in this canto, but also one that is popular in Japanese legends. And I love that they did that. Not only because it would be an obvious pick for a story that revolves around Japanese legends and myth, but because it is a self-explanatory one when talking about the context of Canto 9. Ryoshu, ever since the beginning, ever since she broke out of the House of Spiders, has only ever had one goal in mind: become stronger, gather more allies, and finally rescue her daughter, who she has placed inside the T-Corp safe where she herself used to hide inside, assumingly from the abuse of her own parents, who didn't share the same feelings of love to her as she did to Araya. Now, in come a few tiny little things that I actually dislike heavily about this aspect of the story. First, the concept of temporal entanglement. So we all know time is already an abstract concept in the city, as every time when Ryoshu uses the T-Corp safe, the time inside the safe stops for her entirely, whilst the outside world proceeds normally. Yet in the same instance, when Araya used it, it didn't function as intended, because Ryoshu apparently had a special blood that allowed her to perceive time differently, which would have made for a convincing argument, but they never made any previous hints about this being the case at all. Though they do attempt to expand upon this concept of Ryoshu's speciality a bit more after the canto, so that's a bit reassuring. Yet, despite all of that, I still think they managed to give a good closure to her story. Ryoshu, after a duel to the death with the one person she truly cared for, unconsciously has severed her last thread that she desperately didn't want to. She entered the state of Muga, which in Japanese would translate to selflessness, someone who is free of self-attachment, and I would say that would be an apt term to fit onto Ryoshu, because essentially, she severed everything: her contracts with Limbus Company, her chains linking her with Dante and the other sinners, and of course, the final thread linking her to her beloved daughter. And in all of this chaos, Araya managed to reach out to Dante, confirming that the thread has in fact not yet been cut between her and her mother, but in fact has only thinned down over the years. And with Dante's new Durante ability, it gave Araya the help she needed to reaffirm her ties with Ryoshu, one that is forever going to be inseparable.
글씨는 이제 잘 읽을 수 있니?
응, 당근이지. 그래도 역시 묘수가 제일 좋아.
In general, whilst I did have some minor gripes about Araya as a character, I ended up really liking how Project Moon portrayed the relationship between the two characters. And furthermore, I really just appreciate how they always show that there is a more human side to Ryoshu when she's around her daughter, compared to the cold, ruthless demeanor she has when she's around her own nurse fathers. Now, speaking about nurse fathers, it's time to finally address our last candidate, the main man of Canto 9 himself, the legendary role player, Rien, the Index Nurse Father. His role is arguably the most important in the entirety of the Canto, as not only is he the unofficial leader of the House of Spiders, he's also in fact the only one who still remains in the Index and hasn't been kicked out. Now obviously, we can't talk about Rien without mentioning the Index, the finger that is in theory the most connected to the will of the city, which is what they're believed to be manifest in the prescripts given to them on a daily basis. What makes Rien so interesting is that he essentially embodies what it means to be a part of the Index, and this is further proven as when Ryoshu asks the man whether any part of him is real or genuine, he simply answers with the obvious.
나 정말 없는 것 같네.
In my last video, I talked about why the Index and by extension the will of the city itself is such a scary concept, as they embody a more all-encompassing role in the horror of the city, and this is what Rien's existence basically proves, as obviously his entire character is supposed to be a mockery of Roland's. The way he fights, the way he dresses, and even up to his literal life story has been specifically crafted by a so-called god of the city. And the saddest part, or I guess scariest in this instance, is that he knows the pointlessness of going up against the will of the city, since the belief that is particularly strong in the Index is that the city itself is its own entity, and that its beliefs are an absolute. But beneath all of this, it is hinted that Rien did actually have some genuine feelings of care for Ryoshu, one that isn't ordained by the prescripts, but one that is born from the deepest parts of his own heart. This might sound crazy to a lot of people, but I also really like how they portrayed Rien's traits of nihilism, which is of course also eerily similar to Roland's and even Honglu's. The powerlessness to stop change from coming onto his life, and to save the ones he loved from certain demise is also an integral part of his character. But in the end, he still had hope in Yoshihide, the small probably genuine feeling of love from a parent to his children, that she would one day return home and probably sever the thread bounding him. Not the one bounding him to Ryoshu or the House of Spiders, but the one forcibly attaching him to the will of the city.
모래성을 부수는 게 슬프니까. 그래서 파도는 바람에 의해 움직여. 바람이 불면 그건 밀물과 썰물이 되어서 눈앞에 있는 건 다 허물어뜨릴 수밖에 없지.
There are no character in this Canto that is more multifaceted than Rien, and I think Project Moon has absolutely nailed the concept of writing an index proxy. And the craziest part about this, I still think there are still so much to uncover about his character, as one of the most popular existing theories are about how Rien is actually supposed to represent the Yoshihide of the story, and our own Ryoshu was actually meant to be the masterpiece that he created, aka the Hell Screen, accurate to the book. In the end, Canto 9 ended up being my favorite story that Project Moon has done so far, cause I think they absolutely nailed the main concept of the story they wanted to tell. And I hope I expressed that solely with how long this video ended up being. And I still think I missed a lot of important things because I never did ended up discussing any of the apprentices in certain detail. But yeah, I don't want to prolong the video any longer, so as always, if you've made it to the end, thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.